So it first gives me great pleasure to launch this Center for Digital Agriculture Distinguished Speaker Series. We have our first event of the series today. And before I hand it over to Dr. Katie Triggs-Campbell to introduce our speaker, I just want to say a couple of words about the series. We are hoping to make this roughly once a month to bring in eminent speakers in various areas of digital agriculture. And this is an open series for anyone who is interested both at Illinois and outside. We hope to grow the the series through word of mouth. And so please feel free to publicize the speakers and the series. And if you're interested in joining the mailing list for the Center for Digital Agriculture, definitely please get in touch either with me or with Melanie Moore, who sent out the announcements. Our next speaker is going to be on April 6th, so just over a month from today, also from 1 to 2 p.m. And that will be Dr. Daniel Berkman, who is really one of the founding figures in the area of precision agriculture, precision livestock farming. And he recently moved from KU Leuven, where he spent many decades, to University of Tennessee. But he will be our speaker next month. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Katie.
Thank you. So I am very pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker today. So Professor Cyril Stackness is currently running the photogrammetry and robotics lab at the University of Bonn. So prior to that, he was with the University of Freiburg and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. So he's won many recognitions and awards and is particularly well known within the robotics community for his efforts in field robotics. But his research broadly focuses on perception and navigation for mobile robots with applications in service robotics, self-driving cars, and of course, agricultural robots, which will be the topic of today's presentation. So beyond his individual research lab, Cyril is also one of the spokespeople for a cluster of excellence called PhenoRob, which is very similar in its efforts and aims to AI farms. So there's lots of connections between the work that he's been doing and the work broadly at the University of Bonn and what we've been working on here. So with that very brief introduction, I will now pass the time over to Professor Stackness. And thank you again for joining us today. We're super excited to have you here.
Thanks, Katie, for the introduction. It's also my pleasure to be here. And I heard already that it's basically lunchtime at your side. For me, it's already past dinner time. But this means I need to introduce and entertain you now for the next hour, and I'll try to do this with a lot of visuals and don't go too much into whatever math or technical details, but try to explain what we are doing and what we're capable at the moment here in Bonn. So, and I want to talk here especially about agricultural robotics, which is just one small part of the cluster of excellence PhenoRob that we are having in Bonn, which is again very similar to your AI Institute, also from the amount of funding and the runtime. So robots for sustainable crop production. Why should we care about this? Why do we need that at all? And why is this actually relevant? So why should you be here? So if we look into the amount of biomass that we actually need to produce as mankind, starting from 2010 to 2050, so within 40 years, there's approximately the same amount of biomass that we had been producing from the beginning of mankind until 2010. So once is 40 years, and the other is a much, much longer period in time. And in addition to that, we have that constraint that we need to do this in a sustainable manner. And this poses several other challenges in there. And as I will point out in this talk, robots offer one possibility, maybe one new pathway to do this in a better and more sustainable manner. So first of all, why is there such an increase in agricultural production or crop production that we need? First of all, we are not only eating our crops, we're also using this as fuel for our cars. And if you look the increase in biofuel over the last decade, we see an increase of approximately 100%, which has a certain contribution to this. We also see other things, such as an increased meat consumption worldwide that is expected to happen also in this period over the next 30 years, so approximately 45% in increased meat consumption. Why is this an issue? This is an issue if you compare the amount of calories that is generated by eating, for example, beef meat, compared to the calories that we would consume if you would actually eat the crop that the cow is eating. And this leads to the 7 to 10 times more land use for the same amount of calories produced. So by more people eating more meat, we are also substantially increasing the amount of biomass that needs to be produced so that the animals we eat can actually grow and also have something to eat. Last but not least, there's another big challenge, which is especially here in Germany an important factor, and this is the loss of biodiversity, in parts caused by the pesticide use that we're having. So there are studies running now over approximately 30 years, which show that we have lost around 75% of the flying insects only in protected areas. So in the unprotected areas, it's potentially even more. So there's a substantial loss in the biomass of flying insects, and this also starts to cause serious issues. And this becomes more and more an issue, also a political issue here in Germany, at least. So if we just kind of sum that up a little bit, we see that crop production faces several challenges today. On the one hand side, we have the demand for higher yields. At the same point in time, the amount of arable land that we have and natural resources is actually limited, so we can't simply scale that up. We are still using substantial amount of agrochemicals, which has negative impacts on the agroecosystems. And so one of the questions is, how can we reduce this? But it's not always that easy because, of course, those agrochemicals are typically needed in order to keep the yield high. And also climate change starts to be more and more of a challenge, especially in the sense that breeding actually gets slower than the adaptation that is needed that's caused by climate change. So if you look 20 years back, then the breeding was kind of a bit faster in the adaptation, at least here for the crops we are having in Germany. But now kind of climate change took over in terms of speed and adaptation speed that we would need. So increasing breeding speed is also something which would benefit us. So the central question that we are focusing on here in Bonn is how can we reduce the negative impact of crop production on the agroecosystem and at the same point in time address the demand for higher yields. And again, the robotics technology that we are developing in my group and other groups here in Bonn is just kind of one pillar in this cluster which tries to tackle this question. So, but first of all, let's have a look, how can we do that? How can we reduce the negative impacts and at the same point in time address the demand for higher yields? And if you look into the yield, we have something which is called the actual yield and also the potential yield. So basically potential yield is if everything would be perfect, and actual yield is actually what we are producing on our field. Then we basically have two levers with which we can push the actual yield, but also the potential yield up. And this is basically breeding and crop management. So having better varieties of crops which are more resistant, for example, against certain stressors, has a potential to increase the yield. At the same point in time, targeted management and intervention actions may also supporting an increase in yield. So these are kind of the two things we can use in order to improve the situation here with respect to yield. And if you look into the inputs that we give into the agroecosystem, such as fertilizers, pesticides, or other agrochemicals, they are contributing substantially to the negative impact on the agroecosystem. That's probably not the whole part of the equation, but it's a substantial part, and I will be focusing here on the inputs. And we can actually see, or at least assume, that by using breeding, improved breeding and targeted management interventions, we can also reduce the inputs that we need to put into the agroecosystem while not compromising the yield at the same point in time. And so this improved breeding and improved management are kind of two things we should focus on in order to make steps forwards here along this vision. And so within our cluster, we have several what we call research areas, which is similar to a thrust on your side probably. The first one is in the area of developing digital technologies supporting agriculture. So we're looking here into UAVs, into ground vehicles, into perception systems. Machine learning and data science plays an important role in here. And this is also kind of my home. So I'm a person coming from the robotics background, studied computer science. And so this is kind of the area where I'm in and where I do my research. But there are also other larger research areas active. One looks into the understanding of plant and soil, looking into plant models, phenotyping activities above ground and below ground, using this partially in greenhouses, partially in controlled environments, in field environments, but partially also broad acre agriculture. And then we have a third area which looks into integrating these findings into environment and economy. So this has a lot to do with simulations. So how can we change certain input parameters and what's kind of the predicted output of this change? How can we simulate that? How can we optimize this as a kind of closed loop and also make sure that the things we're actually proposing make sense from an economic point of view? Because everything which kind of helps towards a more sustainable crop production will not be adopted on large scale if it's economically not viable. And I will be looking here in kind of this first part of these research themes and look into my own research. So basically introduced activities we're doing in the cluster at the broad scope so far, and now go a bit more down and want to show you some possibilities where I think how we can use robots or agricultural robots, especially in the context of monitoring and intervention actions towards a more sustainable agriculture. So the question is, how can we build robots, or what needs to be the capabilities of robots so that they are of use? And two words here are important, and this is monitoring and this is intervention. So monitoring is the task of actually observing the field with sensor data, for example, with UAVs flying over the fields or robots driving over the field, or maybe even sensors placed in the environment. And we need to understand what's going on. So what is the status on the field? Are there certain pests which are currently occurring? Is there drought stress on the plant? So getting this information, what's going on the field, is something that I will call monitoring here. And monitoring is basically a passive process. It doesn't do anything. So next thing is then going towards the intervention actions, doing the right thing based on the knowledge that we actually have acquired using our robots and our sensor data. And I will start here with the monitoring part and then move in the second part of my talk toward the intervention, or what are certain intervention actions that I'm doing in my group on the fields here. So let's start with monitoring. What's kind of the easiest or simplest form of monitoring that we can do at a somewhat larger scale? And we started out with using UAVs for crop monitoring. So what you see here is a Dji Phantom 4, a couple of years old, one of those drones that probably your kids use to film cool YouTube videos. They're costing $1,000, $1,500, something along these lines, are equipped with a fairly decent camera. You can point this camera downwards, as you see it here on the image, fly over your field, collect the data, and then build models of the environment, geometric models, also semantic models, and in order to assess the status of the field. And if you're from robotics, say, that's actually a known problem. This is basically a combination of semantic scene understanding and SLAM or bundle adjustment, depending on the community you're in. So we want to interpret semantically what's going on in the scene, and we want to build a geometric model of the environment. And these are kind of this bundle adjustment SLAM. So SLAM stands for Simultaneous Localization and Mapping, and the semantic analysis. And how can we do that? So assuming that the kind of geometric estimation part is, I don't want to say solved, but kind of solved to a certain degree that we can use it here in the field, we can fly with UAVs and basically build maps or auto photos of what's going on, basically with commercial software today. What's more of a challenge and not fully solved yet is the task of interpreting what we are actually seeing. So if we take a single image taken from a field, you see here on the left-hand side, one of those images taken from a sugar beet field here in Bonn, then what we want to have is we want to turn this image into an interpreted image. And the interpreted image you can see here on the right-hand side, where green is basically the plant we are growing on the field, in this case, sugar beet plants, and the red pixels correspond to wheat plants, and the bluish is basically an overlay of the soil. So what we want to have is we want to have a system which turns this image data into this interpreted image data, where we have a label basically saying what we see for every pixel. And that's something that we call semantic segmentation. And that's a fairly common task in robotics and computer vision that we're doing. And if you ask any random person from that field how they would do that, probably they would start with something called a convolutional neural network doing semantic scene interpretation. And that's something which is a technique which is popular since maybe 10 years, made popular in the computer vision community. and is also now used on robots quite often. And so we can do this, for example, in robotics for interpreting street scenes. So I work in autonomous driving as well. So we need to understand what's going on in front of our vehicle, or we have robots that interact with or kind of group all the humans here shown with this greenish pixels or greenish colored pixels, having automatic systems which turn images into this type of interpreted images. And I and my group have been working in this area since quite a while, and we are especially looking into online processing. And so there's a system which is called Bonnet, which we developed a couple of years back, which allows you to do this processing online. So you can just see here an example of a driving scene and a music video where every single frame individually is interpreted by the algorithm. And we're looking here really into high-speed processing. So this runs at 70 Hertz, so 70 times per second, so that we can actually run that on UAVs, on ground robots on the field. Again, it's not the absolutely perfect result. And if you filter those individual detections over time, you get much better. But the key thing here is we can actually do that fast with fairly limited computational resources. And this is kind of nice if you want to do interpretations on the fly and then combine this with targeted intervention actions. Let's stick for the moment with the analysis so far. What we can do if we have this interpretation, train this system now for detecting, for example, crop and wheat plants, we can actually drive over fly over a field and analyze the images that we are recording, and then build maps, so geometric maps, basically 2D floor plan maps, so we call them orthophotos, where we are able to label every individual plant. And we can see in certain areas there's a high wheat pressure, so we may have some wheat control that should be run in a certain area. Other areas look totally fine, no action is needed, and others have a slow growth, so maybe some fertilization is needed. So just with this kind of small example over here, we can actually highlight that having a detailed assessment of what's going on the field allows you to do targeted interventions. And if you think about fertilization and weeding here, you may only need to run weeding in a certain part of the environment and spray your herbicide there. And the fertilization is also only maybe needed for a small part of the field. So how do we run those interpretation systems here so that they really work well? So I've shown so far examples where we basically can download images of people, which we find en masse in the internet, in order to do this interpretation task. If you want to do this for plants, it's actually trickier, especially if you want to distinguish crops and wheat plants. And we have been put quite a bit of effort in there in trying to use background knowledge or things we already know about the problem in order to bootstrap those convolutional neural networks in order to be more efficient. So being able to get good results with a small amount of training data. And one of the things we actually started with is helping the network to find better features. So what those CNNs do is they are not just a classification system which assigns a semantic label to every pixel. They also learn features, and that made CNNs or neural networks in general so powerful as we know them today. But we already have some idea which features are useful to do certain distinctions. We may either know that because we have these good old textbooks where it's written in there to what kind of patterns we should be looking into in order to distinguish plants. Or maybe we have built semantic segmentation systems in the past, in the pre-neural network time, where we had to design features by hand. And we already learned which features are good starting points for certain actions. So what we have been doing here, we are basically using a higher dimensional input. So not just the RGB image that we have, but adding additional feature dimension. This could be vegetation indices. This could be certain patterns such as texture features or gradients, which are computable in closed form. And then we can give the network as a starting point for better interpretation to basically simplify the task of the network so it can learn good classifiers with a small amount of training data. And it turns out with this system, we are able to get the same effect or the same performance than a network, which without this additional input representation would need 10 to 100 times more training data. And that's really great if you can reduce your labeling effort by a factor of 10 or even 100. And still at the same point in time, the more data we collect, the better the possibilities of the network to actually learn own feature representations. But we basically gave the network a very good starting point in order to do a good job. And this was actually really helpful for us in order to build up the first systems that we could actually run on the field and that generalize pretty well also to new environments. And we can run this for interpreting crops and weeds on a field. We can use this to segment berries in vineyards and doing other types of interpretation actions. And most of our systems today use this idea or a variant of this idea in order to do this interpretation task. We can also do this now at large scale. So what you see here are breeding plots where different varieties of crops have been planted, and we can analyze them, we can segment them, we can also estimate the stem location with this UAV and get a really fine-grained analysis of what's going on the field. Use this then for deriving phenotypic traits and do certain estimation tasks and obtain that data in a fairly objective fashion. We can also do things like ear counting in wheat, and you can see already here from this example, we can actually pinpoint every individual ear of wheat plants quite accurately, and then use this at a fairly large scale to analyze what's actually going on the field. And we can do this today also quite easily with UAVs, with standard UAVs that you can actually buy. So this is an example of one of those breeding plots where you see this individual plots down there where different varieties are planted which need to be analyzed. And we can actually use a single drone flight with a high resolution camera. So we're using here 100 megapixel cameras, fly over those fields and get a really high resolution. So this is 5 hectares recorded with a single drone flight at a 2 millimeter ground sampling distance. So that means every pixel represents an area of 2 by 2 millimeters. And so if you can zoom in, this is kind of the first zoom state, and we can actually even zoom down. And this is kind of the native resolution that the camera is actually producing. You can see at this level of detail, you can actually perform a quite detailed analysis and interpret what's going on from a single flight. This also led to one of the companies we have spin-off called PhenoInspect, which is a company which uses these drone flights and provides detailed analysis and for breeders, and is now also operating commercially so that we can replace kind of the manual assessment on the field, which is typically done by a human in the field, in an automatic fashion, do that at large scale, at really high resolution, and also provide objective measures so that you can, in future years, go back in the past and have a really fine-grained analysis of what was actually going on. And what we're going to get rid of is actually this manual assessment of plant performance indicators or growth stages or other parts, which is traditionally done by hand manually. And we want to automate that with PhenoInspect, which is one of the companies which we spun off from our cluster of excellence. So there are different things we can do, homogeneity analysis of how do different plants behave under certain parameters. We can do fertilization trials where we record the fields and then estimate the growth of the individual plants and see which fertilizer has which effect on which kind of soil, and then do a different analysis, what has been grown with different fertilizers, analyze them, and then make an assessment on how the individual, how many fertilizer lead to kind of which effect. And this is just kind of one example that we are offering. There are also things like emergence counting, wheat mapping, breeding plot analysis, and also non-chemical weed control, which are applications that this perception system actually enables. And this is kind of the first building block on which a lot of activities we are actually doing in my group are built upon, and we try to get better in our interpretations, derive better phenotypic traits in order to help people working with these traits to assess them at really large scale, also at a very high frequency, because in the end, I can fly with my UAV every day or every second day or 2 times per week over the fields and analyze those fields at a resolution in time and space, which was not easy to do beforehand. If you now want to go a bit more into the details and kind of get even more information about a plant, we can actually go into the lab and scan individual plants with high resolution scanning techniques. So this is an example of a tomato plant which has been scanned, or serious tomato plants actually have been scanned by my colleague Heiner Kuhlmann. They, as a group, working on high precision laser scanning. So doing laser scanning and registration in the nanometer area with special scanners. So this is a process which takes a lot of time, is so a very long effort to do those scans, but you can actually generate really high resolution models. And what you can see here is tomato plant at different points in time. And what we are looking here is how can we actually register those 3D models also over time. So at the end, we get a 4D model of our plant. And this is a quite challenging task because you can see here in this example already, the appearance of the plant actually changes quite substantially. And how can we make the data association between what the plant looks like on day 1 and what it looks like on day 10, which is a pretty challenging task. So we started with this, with the this plant registration by first extracting skeletons, because we know that the plant is basically has a tree structure, or at least from a technical point of view, it's a tree. And we can actually build this, exploit the fact there's a tree and do things like computing skeletons, which we can do fairly easily. And the skeletons actually allows us to do a lot of the registration tasks easier, do a first registration with those skeletons, and then do a more fine-grained registration. So we can then have skeletons taken at different points in time. And what we then need to do is basically make the data association between the skeletons. So which point on the blue skeleton belongs actually to which point on the green skeleton? This is the question that we need to answer. And it's typically an easier to answer question than looking into the full point cloud. And this is work done by my former PhD student, Yvette Chebrou, who is now a postdoc at the University of Oxford, who worked on this data association and looking into hidden Markov models in order to find better data associations in these kind of complex problems where the shape can change over time. And once we have a data association like this one over here, just only showing the skeletons, we can actually use an optimization procedure to deform one skeleton to the other and then deform one point cloud into another point cloud. And again, if you're a person who worked in robotics, then you may say, hey, that looks actually pretty similar to something we would call graph-based SLAM in dynamic environments, in environments where the environment or the object in the environment change. And this is actually true. Graph-based SLAM uses a graph. Here we have a tree, so it's a simplified form of a graph. And we have this what we call the simultaneous localization and mapping problem. That's something that we have been working in the robotics community since 20 to 30 years now. And a lot of approaches have been developed, and also approaches I actually have been developing. There's an example from autonomous driving, again, another example where you see a vehicle driving over streets and using laser scanners in order to build those maps of the environment. Again, the car is driving through the environment and tries to make data association. And the only thing which is different now in here is that we're not living in a static or in a rigid world. We're living in a non-rigid world because the plant grows over time. So we need to take different deformations into account in order to make those data associations. And we can do this with our skeletons and define different types of constraints or transformations that can be involved in there. So instead of rigid body transformation that we used in SLAM, we can look into affine transformations. We may have regularization terms. We have cost terms for the correspondences. What's a likely correspondence? What's an unlikely correspondence? And with this, we can turn this actually into an optimization problem and use some of the existing optimization frameworks which are out there in order to do this registration. And then come up with a 40 registrations over space and time with data associations, which now allows us to deform the individual plant parts. And as a result of this, we can actually deform a plant in simulating its growth over time. So what you see here in pink is basically not a real plant, but an estimated plant. And the gray point clouds which are coming in are always actual measurements. And we can see how we can simulate or interpolate between these observations and simulate the plant growth over time based on the observations that we have, also the emergence of new parts of that plant. And this allows us then to basically track the development of organs over time. And there are some examples over here how we can, for example, track the length of individual organs over time, depending when they emerge in this plant, and provide for every individual plant quite detailed analysis of how they grow, with which speed they grow, and then can use this to compare different varieties, for example, with respect to each other. So this was so far examples from the lab environment. We are right now trying to get that out into the field and try to do this with UAV-based data. So what you see here is, again, top-down view of the images taken, and then basically 3D models estimated with a bundle adjustment or structure for motion procedure in order to get this 3D structure of the plant. But the problem what we are having here are a lot of occlusions and things that the manual scanning of the human in the lab, the human basically took care of that problem, that this problem has been resolved, but here it's actually much harder. And it turns out that all the occlusions that we have prevent us from actually getting a good model and then doing a good phenotypic analysis of those plants. And so what we have been investigating recently, or it's just one of the works submitted to be presented at ICRA in May is trying to combine these SLAM system with template models, because we basically have an idea how an average plant, for example, looks like, or an average leaf looks like. And then the question is, can we formulate the problem of building those models as a deformation problem on those templates, and then get consistent models of the plant, even of the parts that we are not seeing. And so this is a work that we have been doing. So we can basically start with what I call a template leaf. So it's a very simplistic leaf you can see here. We can define then on this template leaf certain things like stem lengths, leaf curvatures, the different parameters we want to estimate. And then we use this template leaf and deform it so that it fits as good as possible to the observation. Then also those parameters that we defined on this template can still be computed. So just as an example, if this is kind of the 3D model that I built from my raw observations, I can actually fit these individual templates to these leaves and then come up with a template-based model. You basically see the deformed template and then derive those phenotypical parameters for every individual leaf, even if you have a lot of occlusions. And so this is one of the recent work that we are doing and tried in order to deal with the problem that if as soon as we leave the lab, our observations are so much worse and so much more incomplete compared to the data that we would actually get in a lab environment. And this is a part of the monitoring activities that we have been doing in the lab so far. And now I want to use the remaining part of my talk to look a little bit into the intervention part. So from knowing what's going on into doing the right thing. So what should we actually do if we want to not just monitor our fields, but also make decision of what to do? So there are different ways how we can address a problem. I actually want to start here with weed control, probably because it's the easiest problem. I've been working on this for the longest time. So I would say I started in 2014, 2015 with these type of perception problems. And if you look into traditional weed control, this is either conventional agriculture where the whole field is basically sprayed with herbicide in order to eliminate the weed plants. Or if you go into organic farming, there this is basically a manually done job. So you basically can see those people here basically lying behind a tractor driving over a field. In this example, I think picking carrots or weeds around carrots and doing the weeding task in here. And depending on the size of your farm, you can do this with humans, but of course, it's very labor intensive and therefore very costly. And this approach simply doesn't scale up. So that not all the food that we have can be produced in this kind of herbicide-free way, for example. So the questions are, robots a new mean for weed control? And I would argue, yes, they offer the potential to do certain things in a better way. If we already have the perception system that I was talking before, let's say my plant classification system, which tells me every pixel you see here in green is my sugar beet, and every pixel you see here in red is my wheat plant, then we should be able to eliminate the wheat and kill all the kind of red pixels, so to say, all the plants which sit behind the red pixels. And how can we actually do that? And there are different ways how we can do this. The first thing is, depending on the wheat and what we are doing, we can actually do this manually. So this was the first work that we have been done analyzing certain fields for tea producers, which for medical teas, which have to be a high purity. And there is a certain type of wheat called PA wheats, which are not allowed to be on the fields. Otherwise, you're not allowed to sell your tea as a medical or tea according to certain medical standards. And so what happens in the end is we are flying with the UAVs over those fields. We identify this very rare PA weeds, and then actually humans go there and isolate them by hand. And this kind of the simplest task in terms of the actions where we let the human do the action. But again, this is something which scales better than also monitoring the field manually, but there's nothing we can do in larger production. So the question is, can we use robots to actually do that task? And this was our first results in a European project called Flourish, led by Roland Siegwart at ETH Zurich at that time, where we were running the plant classification system that I've been describing here in this black box, basically sitting under the robot and performing the scanning the individual sugar beet plants here and identifying the wheat. And then we can look for new weeds in order to do weed control. So this is an example from a cooperation with Bosch, where basically Bosch built what I call a glorified nail gun. You can see this here, and basically can stem weed plants back into the ground. So while driving over the field and having this perception system, you can actually nail the weed back into the ground, and this way realize a chemical-free weed control. It turned out that this is not the best way to do that. Actually, those stamping systems are not very robust, especially if you drive fast over the field. At least we had substantial issues in order to build systems mechanically which are so robust that they survive a longer period of time in this weed control. And the second problem was you could only eliminate actually weeds which have been fairly small. But nevertheless, you can actually do that and can also combine this with other types of weeding. So you can combine this with a spraying system as well. So for that, you need to detect not only the semantic, so which semantic class it is, you also need to detect the stem location for certain applications. And then you can actually let the system decide, should I spray something? Should I stamp parts? And based on what the system sees, where are stem locations, it can decide what to do. For example, grass weeds should be sprayed, but very selectively. So you want to spray only the blue weeds in this example. You don't want to touch the green plants, and the red plants you can actually stamp away. And this was one of the systems that we have deployed and actually running on a prototype on our farms, doing the first kind of weed control system in a non-conventional way for us. We are currently also going a step further with a company called Escada, which tries to use lasers in order to burn away the weed as another way for replacing the stamping mechanism. So this was one of the, I think, the video of the first weed burning experiment that we have done in this example. I think it was a 6-watt laser, which here burned the stem location of this weed, of course, in a very controlled environment. Today, we can do that much faster. It doesn't take multiple seconds. We can do this in around 10 to 13 milliseconds per plant now with a much more high power laser. So while we're driving over the field and are detecting the weed plants, we can actually burn away this weed. And we hope that actually in this spring, we will have the first prototype also being shipped to the US, to a larger fruit producer in the US, and having the first trials of this system in practice with this company as an alternative way for using chemical-free weed control. These are kind of just 2 examples how we can do actions and execute weeding actions on the field. But there are still a lot of challenges which are out there. And even for these simple or fairly simple weeding tasks, this is not always very easy. And still, we're coming back a bit to the perception problem, which is also kind of a bit my home base. So I'm tied a bit more to the perception problems than to the action problems, maybe. Is that the conditions that we see on the field change dramatically. So if we train a classification system in Bonn and ship it to our partners in Stuttgart or at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, although this is geographically, actually, everything is pretty close, just a few hundred kilometers away, the conditions vary substantially. And if we train a system in Bonn and ship it to Switzerland, we will actually see a very low generalization performance. And in this example over here, if you train on field E, move to field B, the conditions are different. We are using a different robot, a different camera, maybe still the same value crop, but maybe a different growth stage, different weeds are popping up. Then those systems will have what we call a low generalization performance. So instead of reaching whatever 95 or 98% of the plants correctly classified, this drops down to something like 70, 80%, which is typically not what we want to have. So a lot of the effort we have been doing is kind of into the question, how can we actually change this and transfer from one environment to another environment? So if our source domain, let's say training happened here in Stuttgart and we have beautifully labeled data, and then we go to a target domain in Bonn and the images look totally different. Even though it was also sugar beet field, but if we just run the classifier learned on our source domain, on our target domain, we get a really poor performance and it's basically unusable. So the question is, how can you fix this to actually get the correct classification result? And we do this with approaches what we call domain adaptation or transfer, where we can either transfer a classifier from one domain to another domain, but having we have a few examples which are labeled from both domains, or we look into kind of style transfer based systems with GANs, a special form of neural networks, which are actually able to do this. And one of the works that we have been doing is using these GANs for style transfer, which you may know from photos that we can upload a photo on a website and it turns your photo into a painting, maybe a Van Gogh painting or a painting of a certain artist. This basically is a form of style transfer of this image. And we've been using a similar technology here and adding additional semantic information we know about the plants to maintain the semantic segmentation system and make sure it gets the same performance, even if we transfer an image from a style A to a style B and from a style B back into a style A. So that we have a transfer function where we can turn the images from our target domain into images which look like those in the training domain, so that we then have or get back high generalization performance with something in the mid-90s percentages of precision and recall, so that we have a system which is still operational under good conditions. But again, there's a lot of challenges which are out there, transferring data from UAVs to ground vehicles, different types of cameras, maybe different spectral bands, different robots, different environments. So this is just kind of the first part of the problem that we are actually tackling here. Besides weed control, we're also looking into crop protection and trying to identify plant diseases. Here, the problem typically is, as soon as you see with your eye the changes in the plant, it's often too late to do an intervention actions. And we've been looking here into hyperspectral sensing and multispectral sensing in order to find traits or indications that there's an infection by a plant disease before it's actually visible with the human eye, so we can actually react very early on. This turns out to be quite challenging in with hyperspectral data if we do this in the field environment. So in a lab environment, that works fairly well. In a field environment, all the calibration aspects, especially with hyperspectral sensing, is still very challenging, so that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in here. And I actually want to slowly come to the end of my presentation. I just want to give you a small outlook about a work that we have been submitting last week to IROS. So IROS deadline was this morning, where we look into perception system, to harvesting in a greenhouse. Here, looking into sweet peppers. And the question is here, can we infer what we don't see? So guessing the hidden part. So you have a robotic system which drives through one of our greenhouses and perceives the data. In this case, it's an RGBD camera, and only sees part of the fruit. And the question is, can we actually complete those models to better plan, for example, harvesting actions then? And so what we have is an RGBD scan of an individual fruit, in this example over here. And we as humans can do that actually really well. If we know that's a sweet pepper and we have this kind of scan, we at least have an idea on how that sweet pepper will actually look like. And what we have been doing here is actually using a neural network, which basically completes the scene, just basically a scene completion approach, which can hallucinate a model and trying to say, okay, most likely given the observation on the left-hand side, the crop, which I haven't seen due to self-occlusions or occlusions of leaves, is probably looking like this, so that we can better plan, for example, manipulation actions. And the way we are doing this is, again, using this high-resolution LiDAR data, which we use now to scan the tomato plants and build highly accurate models of different sweet peppers, for example, and then scan those also with an RGBD camera, so that we can train a neural network which has this low-resolution partial views of the RGBD data with this high-resolution LiDAR models, and then learn how to complete those models. And we can do this with different types of sweet peppers and also different fruit varieties. And it works surprisingly well that we can actually complete those models just by having an individual view. So that if we have a system in action and observe certain parts, we can actually estimate where the fruits are. This may help for yield estimation and also for manipulation actions. And again, this is quite novel work. We have only run this partially in action, so not in a full interaction so far. Only the completion part is working, but these are kind of the next steps that I and my group are currently working on. So in sum, I hope we are seeing more and more robots working on our fields in agriculture for crop production. Could be flying vehicles, ground vehicles, so that we can build better systems which are better suited to maintain our fields. And from my point of view, the robotic monitoring and intervention systems that I've just sketched in here have a potential to change a lot of different ways how we do them in agriculture today. And several of the technical challenges that we see or problems that we need to solve require, on the one hand side, a combination of technical expertise, but also agricultural expertise. And this is something great if you're working in an environment where you can bring people from plant sciences or agricultural study programs together with people working because we typically, or my experience, you need to have both sides in order to actually build systems that work fairly robustly. Because even if we as the technical people build those systems, we have too little understanding of the underlying problems in order to come up with the right solutions. although I've shown that certain things are possible here today and work on prototypes or are on its way to, let's say, commercialization, there are still a lot of challenges that we need to address in terms of looking into the variations among different species, locations, different points in time. So there's a lot of tasks that actually need to be done. And I still think that the whole harvesting is still a problem which is very challenging, and still robots need to get better, faster, more robust, not only in the perception part and basic intervention, or let's say simple intervention parts, but if you look into harvesting of sweet peppers, for example, of strawberries or other plants, this still poses a lot of challenges. But the great thing in here is it allows us to do tasks or solve problems which are really relevant for our society, and as kind of one of the few points in time where I, as an engineer, can say, okay, maybe I do something which has a direct positive impact on problems that our society is facing. And therefore, it's something that I really like doing and working on this since something like 8 years now, when I first got in touch with the agricultural problems, and still enjoying this. So with this, thanks again for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
I have a question
Sure.
if I can get the ball rolling. So I think that you had a lot of really promising, exciting applications of robotics and computer vision. Many of them were for production agriculture as opposed to research activities or development activities like breeding. And obviously production agriculture is much more cost sensitive in practice. So are there technical solutions, or in other words, can research from our community help in bringing down the cost of some of these technological ideas that you've been working on and that we are also working on?
So, I mean, if we think which kind of intervention action, so from my point of view, the intervention actions are the things which are hardest to realize, especially in a cost-effective way, especially if you think about robotic systems and we need to fully automate processes that they run fast. This is one of the key factors here. The perception part are not that challenging from my point of view, because for most of the problems that we have, we basically need a camera and we need a computer that actually does the interpretation task. And if you look into certain embedded devices, this is something which I don't think is really the limiting factor, but really having a good intervention is one of the critical aspects. But I mean, the first step in order to realizing this cost effectively is maybe not to go into completely, let's say, chemical-free weeding, but let's say reduce the amount of chemicals that are needed. If you think about spot spraying or very targeted spraying, that you just spray an individual plant and not the whole field, you can reduce the amount of agrochemicals that you need substantially, maybe to something like, some people say 20%, some people say 30%, but kind of in this range. And this is also where commercial applications are going to. So for example, Blue River Technologies, one of the companies bought by John Deere, maybe 2017, something like this. They are basically doing this spot spraying with having a weed detection system, and then just activates the nozzles of your spraying system only when needed. So this is, I think, an approach where you use the technology and basically infrastructure, not fully infrastructure, but at least spraying system which farmers know and are quite familiar with, and just have a kind of a smart way for activating the nozzle. And this is probably the first step in how you can actually bring that out and reduce the amount of agrochemicals. And then the question is, what other intervention mechanisms do we need or can have? So we are again experimenting with these lasers right now, because the nice thing is we are not suffering from all the mechanical issues that we had with the stamping system, which was really a pain because it simply broke too fast. And laser is actually very attractive from this point of view. They come with other challenges. You don't want to burn the field and other things, so it's not that it's very easy to do. But I think it has a big potential in order to solve some of those aspects. As soon as we look into an analysis with respect to plant diseases, then it gets much more costly, especially with these cameras with different spectral bands, because it's less likely that they will go into mass production as regular cameras, so they won't get that cheap that quickly. But maybe there are other ways how you can actually change the landscape here, is that you're not, that you don't require a farmer to actually buy those systems, but you have service providers which buy those platforms and use them at larger scale, basically I won't say 24/7, but for a substantial amount of time monitoring larger fields and then providing these information services to farmers. So these are ways how we see certain services here, at least in Germany. So there are organizations which actually do this called Maschinenring, where it's basically a sharing of those fairly expensive machinery, where this is a first step in order to bringing this out. Maybe in the US, the farms are larger, so for larger farms, it may be economically easier to actually buy those systems, but this is just a hypothesis from my side, not backed up by any economical experience or expertise. So I don't want to claim this, but something that I could see.
Yep.
So coming back to your raw question, I think the intervention is the thing which is most critical from the cost point of view. And so far we haven't found a really good solution either, except of trying to not do too many mechanical interventions, because this seems to be one of the critical factors for that, from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you.
William, or just unmute yourself and then speak up. I think that's the easiest way.
Okay, hello. Yeah, so I guess I have one comment about what you just said here, which was that, kind of maybe seeing a business model in which people could rent out these pieces of equipment for use. So I guess, do you see a use case where this technology is helping smaller farms? I mean, or do you see kind of the kind of large scale agriculture just kind of getting bigger? Is there a way that maybe this could help, say, the organic sector? I know you've talked about with this stomping and that kind of stuff. But yeah, so that was my first question. And then I have a question about fertilizer usage too, if this could be applied to that as well, as opposed to just weeding.
Yeah. So the first question, does it support larger farms or smaller farms? That's a good question. So I think one of the advantages that you can actually build much smaller machines, and the cost of the machine or basically scales with the perception system, the actuation system. So if you can maintain more rows in parallel, the system will get more expensive, because you basically need to linearly duplicate your hardware that is in use. But you don't need a driver anymore. So this is something which fades away. So I actually think that you can actually build smaller and cheaper devices, and that you can also make this accessible to smaller farms. But I can also see that larger farms will profit from this. So I'm not sure that you will be profitable for one or the other. So far, these systems are still slower than the systems which are out there, which are currently doing the weeding, where you just drive over the field and just open your sprayers or nozzles and just spray ahead. You can drive much faster. So speed is still an issue which we are working on, but I think it will allow to create smaller machines in a cost-effective way, but I'm not sure that it will be much better having smaller machines versus larger machines. The only advantage that you may have is that you can do much more targeted applications. So we are, for example, working with one of the larger research institutes for agricultural landscapes in Germany, next to Berlin. And they are running a lot of fields where they have intercropping and patch cropping on the field. So having multiple different plants on the field. And then you can actually start to do intervention actions for specific plants planted on the same field, which offers new possibilities which we didn't have before. But again, this is something which probably won't go into large scale production at the moment. And you had a second question that was, sorry.
Yeah, the second question was more about the, you focused on the intervention side of things, mostly with the weeding problem.
Yep.
And I was curious if some of this perception could help feed the reduction in fertilizer usage, because I know that's a big problem with fertilizer runoff and the algal blooms and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I would even say parts of the fertilization aspect is easier, because you typically don't need to have these fine-grained resolutions. So for the weeding application, you're going to stamp or burn the weed, you need to be precise on a centimeter precision, at least, in order to make sure you actually hit the stem. With the fertilization, it's not that critical. If you're fertilizing, let's say, with 1 square meter resolution, that's probably still absolutely fine, because you don't have the variations that are that small. And they're actually fertilization maps, which you can actually generate and then download to your tractor system, and you can plan that offline or give the instruction to the system offline. You don't need to have this closed loop control. The question is, how do you assess what's the fertilization state. And I'm not the perfect expert in that. We can't do that really well with optical sensors, at least for now. So we are working with the people from the research center ULIC, which do really this large-scale environment monitoring, trying to model all the fluxes in the system out there with different, more complex sensors. But this is still something which is not out there for every farmer to use. And most of the sensors, like the whatever estimating nitrogen, they typically use just some proxies in order to estimate what the nitrogen status is. At least that's what those people tell me all the time, and they're not really measuring the nitrogen concentration or certain nitrogen fluxes, which are simply hard to measure. And so you need to combine this more with simulation, or with measurement, and then a simulation system which simulates your agro-ecosystem. But from the whole application point of view, I think it's an easier problem because your spatial resolution is orders of magnitude slower than what you need. So again, 1 square meter resolution is probably even more than you would need for fertilization.
Great. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the talk.
Looks like we have some questions in chat. Do you want to chime in or speak up, or should I read your question?
Sure, sure. So, Professor, I really enjoyed your talk. It was an amazing talk.
Thank you.
So, could you please elaborate on the style transfer? Like, the generalization performance was pretty impressive. So, how exactly is it working? Like, are we changing the background and just keeping the plants there? Or...
So it was kind of a standard GAN network, and the main thing that we have introduced here was that we have also semantic consistency. So the trick was you run your semantic segmentation system on your original image, you transfer it into the other domain, and then transfer it back from that domain. And want to make sure that the semantic segmentation that you get out if you do the transfer twice is identical to the original semantic segmentation you had before. And once you have that, then you have a pretty good indicator that you can actually, through this transfer, make sure you get the segmentation also in the other domain well. And so this was basically using an existing GAN system. So this was, I think, IROS 2020 published, so 1.5 years ago by Daria Gogol, who was the first author. So this work is also already published. But the main trick was to use an existing GAN system which does the style transfer, but make sure we have this semantic consistency of the transfer. And this was kind of the game changer in order to get high quality results here for us.
Got it. Thanks. And the second question was like, I noticed we had a cover around the plants, and like it pretty much blocked the sunlight on the plant. So in case of bigger plants, like, what would be the approach? Or
okay, so this is something we started with basically because of our limited expertise. We initially used a 4-channel camera, so RGB and near infrared, and we had kind of that shielded to have kind of controlled lighting conditions. This was at the time 2014 when we built our first system, where we're using still random forest classifiers with manual design features, and they were not the most robust thing on earth. By now, we can do this completely without shielding. We are running the thing on drones, so there's not a problem anymore. It's just kind of the system that we had built had that cover because it made our life easier at that point in time when our algorithms haven't been good enough. But since I would say 3 to 4 years, we even skipped or ditched the 4-channel cameras and just by now use standard RGB cameras and get basically the same performance than with the near-infrared channel, which we needed before in order to get a more robust separation of vegetation and non-vegetation to get the background illuminated. So then for that, near-infrared helps a lot. When you just compute the NDVI index, you can basically get rid of all the non-vegetation part. That's something we needed initially, but right now that's not needed anymore. So we can do this from UAVs under basically every condition with respect to sunlight. That's not a problem anymore.
got it, Professor. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris. Hey.
All right. Yeah. Hey. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Cyril. This is a really fantastic work. I am starting to get into agricultural problems, and as a roboticist like you, I'm getting sort of sucked in from the applications and impact side. I was wondering whether you had any ideas about how we can sort of pull more folks from the AI and robotics side kind of into these really interesting problems. We love data sets, we love competitions. Are there sorts of activities that you think might be useful for promoting agriculture and in AI and robotics?
Yeah, definitely. So on a larger scale, so how I came into agriculture was basically through funding programs that at that time the European Commission started when they declared that agriculture will be one of the target areas for all the robotics calls which are out there, which happened in 2013, 2014, around that time. So this brought a lot of people in, or a substantial number into that field. And before I was not aware of agricultural robotics before, maybe my limitations, but for me, it started 2014 when we could get substantial funding for that. But this is kind of a broader scale activity that you need to do on a political level. If you want to act as an individual person, I think the bottleneck is data, and data on two sides. On the first side, you need to collect the data, and it's typically harder to collect data in the agricultural fields than for typically other problems. I mean, you don't have all the privacy issues. If you go with a camera and drive through a city and film people, that's easier if you work with plants. But still, getting that data, getting them consistently over growth stages in the environments, it's still a challenge to do that. And the main problem is annotations. So you can't take the images that you collect, send it to whatever, Amazon Mechanical Turk or all those labeling services and say, hey, please label me sugar beets versus beets. It's a disaster. It's completely unusable because the labelers don't have the expertise. So we're basically recruiting people from the agricultural study programs as student workers for doing the labeling for us, which is the only way to get good labels, at least for us. So if you want to push that forward, we need to create data sets where people can run their algorithms on and start benchmarks with this. And we are doing this now. So we released a couple of data sets, which brought us quite a bit of feedback, and a few people started with this. And we now are in the second year now of collecting data so that we have the same fields monitored over different years with the same labels consistently from ground vehicles and aerial vehicles. So that you can also do this transfer from one year to another year, from one field to a second field, carefully labeled, and that we are currently in the process of creating and releasing. Not sure what happens this year, hopefully by the end of the year, and then have yearly extensions of that data, start challenges in getting people involved in this by giving them data. Because if you talk to one of the more theoretical machine learning guys and they say, yeah, of course, we can try our algorithms on this. Can we have some data? And typically need a lot of data initially. And if it's hard for them to get data, they probably won't start with this because they have other problems where they have good data or can get data more easily. And I think this is one of the limiting factors, getting good data out. And so for weeding, we do this at the moment. We also have some fertilization experiments where you have certain deficiencies of certain micronutrients where we record data also in the field, because we have a few farms which are maintaining now since 120 years fertilization experiments documented. And that's actually a great resource, which not a lot of sites have. So these are activities that we are doing in the cluster because we can fund this centrally. It involves a lot of manpower, but I think this is a way to push this forward, or at least the way that I see how we can actually change that more people are trying their algorithm, their systems on that data and turn that into nice challenges.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Salah, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, my name is Salah Isa. I am an assistant professor in Ag Safety and Health here at the University of Illinois. So I'm really interested in these robotic systems once they get implemented, really in production and are doing work. And my question revolves around understanding failure modes in a sense. So I'm thinking of these robotics or these algorithms, and as you know, they're sensing that production. I'm really curious to see what kind of work you're aware of in basically these systems failing. What kind of I guess a disaster, or how bad can that be, and things along that line.
Okay, so if you think about the weed control task, of course, what can happen is you mistake, you say, oh, there's your sugar beet plant is actually a wheat. and then the sugar beet plant will get eliminated or maybe sprayed and will survive the spraying, or it gets stamped away and then you kill it. But again, even if you look into the humans doing this task, so if you're on those beds behind these tractors and doing your task, you also have a failure rate of something like 4 or 5%. Was substantial. It was quite a large number because the system drives actually fast, and this is kind of the number which is still acceptable for most people. And you will make mistakes quite likely of that type. Those mistakes are, however, not the most critical ones from my point of view.
Yeah, those mistakes I'm not worried about. I'm imagining like a critical failure in the system.
Okay, I mean, if you think about whatever, you have this laser-based weed control system, bad things which could happen is actually you put fire on the field because you're basically burning stuff, and you don't have any means for whatever. You don't have water spray behind it, which kind of distinguishes all the fires which may come up. This could be an issue. Issues, whatever. What happens if your robot flips over and you have your 400-watt laser shooting around in the air or hitting people? I mean, I think there are technical solutions to prevent that if your system flips over, but these are issues which are definitely there. And also all the safety people at the university and wherever are not very excited if you play around with a 400-watt laser, I can tell you. So I don't think the robots are more dangerous than the existing systems that we have out there, because a lot of the prevention systems or safety sensors can actually be used from driving and other parts can actually be employed in those environments to some degree. So I think it actually offers a possibility to actually do things more safely, but of course it comes at a price because you need to install those sensors in those machines. I'm not sure I could answer your question really well because I don't really see at the moment other really bad failure modes, but maybe that's my limited imagination.
Yeah, that's in a sense what I'm trying to, that's really the research topic that I'm interested in, is understanding those failure modes before they reach production so that we could address them as they occur, before they occur. But thank you, I appreciate that feedback.
Joe, do you have a question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So actually my question was partially answered when you're talking about the challenges of the laser systems, because when you said, well, we're using laser in the field, the first thing I thought was like, you're doing that in the wheat field, you're causing a fire. So the natural question for you is like, I understand why the stumping system would have a short shelf life, right? A short life because it is high impact. But why not, have you guys considered using, say, a portable mower or something more blade related to do the weed control? Or if so, why was that ruled out?
Yeah, so there are systems. So that was actually, when I was coming to Bonn in 2014, there was one of the older professors, and they had basically built a large, how's it called? Like a metal circular thing with a lot of blades on it, and it could rotate very quickly in short areas and could basically weed in between the plants. So basically orthogonal to the row. But it was also fairly limited in the precision that you could actually get with those systems. So it wasn't bad. They solved the problem then later on by doing some precision sawing system, so that they would saw the seedlings in a certain pattern, so that the mechanical weeding system was then optimized. So you optimize the seeding for your mechanical removal system. That was a nice experiment, but never really made the kind of breakthrough, I would say. Other options that I see, or which are currently being tried, is with electroshocks. You can actually kill certain plants quite well, or it seems to be. There are some German other startups which go this path, which seem to be quite interesting. And I know people from Australia experiment a lot with microwaves, but they also work really well in terms of killing whatever is out there. But you also destroy a lot of microbiome in the ground, and therefore it doesn't seem to be the best solution. We have the laser. Right now we're solving this by basically having water behind it and kind of watering again, that we prevent any fire. At least it's our kind of first solution to not put fire immediately on the field. Yeah, and so the stamping system basically had the issue that you're basically stamping into the ground. So this is your ground, you're basically stamping into the ground. And if you're driving with 30, 40 centimeters per second, that's totally okay. But if you go with a meter per second, you're basically breaking your stamping system actually quite quickly. And that was kind of the limitation that we had. And even the guys from Bosch who were in that project, who built this Bosch nail guns, couldn't find a good solution to solve this problem. But again, I'm not a mechanical engineer, but even the mechanical guys were not successful on that.
So maybe I'll go next because I've been wanting to ask another question about the disease detection. You said that you were using hyperspectral for that, and that was successful in the lab, but then not as successful in the field. And to me, it feels like it would be disappointing if we couldn't do it with regular RGB, just much lower cost equipment than hyperspectral. So was it your experience that RGB really was not as successful and you really did need hyperspectral to be effective, at least with today's models, today's inference techniques?
So the problem is that depending on the disease, the simply RGB information that your camera picks up is not sufficient to do the task. Same, as soon as you see things with your eye, it's too late. And for those things, I think you don't have a chance. So we played a bit with some rust identification that still worked fairly okay-ish with RGB data. But I mean, as soon as you have a disease where the farmer says, as soon as we see it, it's too late, you won't be successful with an RGB camera. And the goal or the solution is probably having some multispectral cameras. So there are systems with 16 or 25 bands where you can even optimize the bands for your problem. That may be a solution. With the hyperspectral camera, the calibration was too much of a pain if you go out into the field to get that really work robust. You basically need to calibrate for every experiment completely from scratch, and then it's not worth the effort. The best expert who knows how to do this, actually, Anne-Kathrin Marlein. She heads the Sugar Research Institute in Göttingen in Germany. She's probably I would say the one and only researcher who's biggest expertise in this sensing. So I would actually redirect you to her and would recommend to contact you, or I can even establish the contact if you want to go more into the details. She worked for a long time with this hyperspectral cameras. And they're also going towards RGB or RGB plus a few extra bands in order to do disease detection. But she's the one who could answer this question better than I'm able to do that right now.
Understood. Thanks. Okay, I'll maybe get in touch and try and get a contact.
I just quickly wanted to understand your fruit reconstruction of the missing parts.
Yep.
We're trying to do similar things with rocks and quarries. So I assume it's a neural network, so your training data is all taken with LiDAR, and then you're matching the 3D RGBD image?
Yes, partially. So we have the environment where we have a handheld LiDAR scanner where we get a high-resolution model of the fruit, and we have also an RGBD camera. It's basically an Intel RealSense, whatever, D465 or something like this, and you basically can take a lot of observations from all different sides of this plant. Then you can do the precise matching of your RGB data with your high resolution LiDAR data. And we have that, you typically have scanned, I think, 100 different fruits, 20 sweet peppers and of different shapes and different form, strawberries and others. And what you're basically learning is then from all views for an individual RGBD image, for a 4-channel image, you're mapping this directly into a 3D model. And the trick is to not map directly into a mesh. What we are predicting is actually a dense grid of a truncated science distance function. So we are mapping, or we are predicting individual grid values on a 3D grid, where we predict the signed distance values, and then basically run afterwards a marching cubes algorithms in order to actually get the surface reconstruction. So we're not predicting the mesh, we are predicting the TSDF values. And this is something that people, Andreas Geiger did some really nice work on that for autonomous driving and other applications for the scene completion. And we basically used a lot of these ideas that he used in his scene completion stuff for doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to take a moment to thank Cyril very much. This is a really, really interesting, fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Cyril. And we're looking forward to talking to you some more when we talk about our collaborative opportunities in the future.
Perfect, my pleasure. And thanks again for also the interesting Q&A afterwards. This is really highly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.